You keep paying an invisible debt you never agreed to in any conscious way. You keep returning the call. You keep explaining yourself past the point of dignity. You keep adjusting your tone, your timing, your face, your entire inner weather. So the family atmosphere doesn't collapse. It feels necessary because somewhere early you learned that your belonging depended on management, not love, not mutual recognition management. You became the regulator of tension, the translator of moods, the container for what other people refuse to feel, and the cost is precise. Your identity is not built from what you are, but from what prevents other people from unraveling. This is the trap. You confuse your relational usefulness with your moral worth. You confuse being needed with being valued. You confuse I can handle it with this is mine to carry. You do not call it a contract. You call it family, loyalty, being the mature one, not making things worse, keeping the peace. But psychologically, it functions as a contract because it contains terms, penalties, and rewards. The reward is a certain kind of safety, reduced conflict, temporary acceptance, the illusion of harmony. The penalty is chronic self-erasure. You become a role before you become a person. You can feel the contract by noticing what happens the moment you stop performing it. You stop replying immediately. You stop explaining. You say no without a thesis statement attached. You refuse to carry a feeling that is not yours. And the family field reacts as if you violated a law, not because they are evil, not because you are superior, but because the system has been organized around your adaptation. Your reasonableness has become a structural pillar. When you withdraw it, the architecture shakes, and everyone calls that shaking your fault, end quote. Here is the first uncomfortable realization. The family does not only relate to you as you, it relates to the function you perform in their inner economy. Your role is not just behavior, it is a psychic position in a collective arrangement. In Jungian terms, the family is not merely a set of individuals. It is a small, collective, unconscious, repeating patterns older than any one person. You entered a field already charged with unspoken needs, denied affects, and inherited complexes. You did not choose the role with your will. The role chose you through the pressure of the system and your particular sensitivity, intelligence, fear, or longing. The contract usually begins as a bargain with anxiety. You discover early that if you become predictable, calm, helpful, and emotionally readable, then other people become less dangerous. If a parent is volatile, you become quiet. If a parent is fragile, you become strong. If a parent is absent, you become competent. If affection is conditional, you become exceptional. This is not character, it is adaptation under threat. Identity formed through adaptation is not false in the moral sense. It is false in the ontological sense. It is a self built to manage someone else's psyche. A family role is not assigned with a speech. It is assigned through reinforcement. When you overfunction, the room settles. When you stay small, the anger passes. When you take blame, the conflict ends. When you soothe, you are praised for being mature. When you carry secrets, you become trusted. These are rewards, and a reward given under emotional coercion creates a compulsion. Later, you will call it, "I'm just like this." But it is the contract speaking. Keep doing what stabilizes us, and you may belong. Notice how the contract trains your perception. You interpret tension as a problem to solve, not an emotion to witness. You interpret someone else's disappointment as evidence you did something wrong. You interpret your own anger as dangerous. You interpret boundaries as cruelty. That is not temperament. It is training. A psyche conditioned under a family complex will experience basic self-definition as threat, because self-definition disrupts the old distribution of emotional labor. The father complex and mother complex are not abstract concepts here. They are templates, inner structures through which you read authority, intimacy, permission, and guilt. If the father archetype was lived as judgment, unpredictability, or withdrawal, you will treat authority as something you must appease or outsmart. If the mother archetype was lived as engulfment, anxiety, or conditional warmth, you will treat closeness as something you must manage. The contract often demands that you become what the parents could not become: the stable father, the soothing mother, the adult who can tolerate affect without collapse. The child becomes the regulator because the adults could not regulate themselves. And the shadow is woven into this, not the theatrical shadow, but the practical one. Everything you were not allowed to be. Your goodness in the family may have required the exile of your aggression, your selfishness, your need, your refusal, your hunger for attention, your capacity to disappoint. So you split. A portion of you became the compliant persona, what Jung would call the persona in its defensive form, a social mask built not for expression, but for survival. The shadow holds the banned impulses. The contract keeps the shadow underground by making its emergence punishable. That is why you over-explain. Over-clarifying is not communication. It is appeasement disguised as reason. You produce paragraphs because in the family field, being misunderstood was not an inconvenience, it was a sentence. If a parent could punish you for a tone, a look, a delay, then your psyche learns clarity is safety. But the clarity you chase is not real clarity. It is the fantasy that if you can just explain well enough, the other person will become fair, coherent, and responsible. That fantasy is part of the contract. You keep investing language to buy what should have been freely given basic recognition. The family contract also trains you to accept misattribution. You become the cause of moods you did not create. A parent feels shame and calls it your disrespect. A sibling feels envy and calls it your arrogance. A family member feels helplessness and calls it your selfishness for not rescuing them. This is projection. Projection is not merely they accuse you. Projection is an economy. Unwanted inner content is exported into you so the other person can remain innocent. The contract makes you a reliable container for that exported content. You become the designated carrier of the family's disowned affects. You can measure how entrenched the contract is by how quickly you accept the projected story. They say you are cold, and you begin searching your memory for evidence. They say you are selfish, and you begin listing your sacrifices to disprove it. They say you have changed, and you begin apologizing for growing. This is the mechanism. You try to win a trial. You did not request in a court that is not interested in truth. The contract forces you into defense because defense keeps you engaged. Engagement keeps the system stable. This is where narcissistic dynamics can enter, not necessarily through a diagnosable narcissist, but through a narcissistic structure in the family, a relational pattern where one person's self-image is protected at all costs, and others must serve that protection. In such a structure, responsibility flows downward and admiration flows upward. The family needs someone to carry blame so the central figure can remain righteous. Wounded or exceptional, if you are empathic, meaning you are attuned and responsive, you are a perfect candidate for that role. Empath-narcissist entanglement is not romance specific. It is a general psychic pairing. One psyche externalizes discomfort, the other internalizes it. You may have been trained to function as a self-object, not as a person with separateness, but as an instrument for someone else's regulation. When they are anxious, you must reassure. When they are ashamed, you must minimize. When they are angry, you must apologize. When they feel empty, you must supply attention. That is the hidden contract. You exist to stabilize me, and if you fail, you are the problem. This is why your boundaries feel like betrayal. Not because boundaries are wrong, but because the contract equates your separateness with danger. The system also offers a counterfeit identity, the responsible one, the peacemaker, the strong one, the smart one, the one who understands, the one who can take it. These identities are praised because they keep the family functioning without forcing anyone else to change. Praise is not always love. Praise can be a leash made of gold. If your value is tied to your role, then losing the role feels like losing existence. That is why you may keep returning, even when you know it damages you. The contract threatens you with a primitive terror exile. Look closely at the emotional payoff the contract gives you, because you will not dismantle it if you pretend it gave you nothing. The payoff may be moral superiority, the feeling that you are better because you endure. It may be control, the feeling that if you manage everyone, nothing surprises you. It may be identity, coherence, the feeling that you know who you are because you know what you do for others. It may be a kind of meaning, a suffering that feels noble. These payoffs are not virtues. They are compensations. They keep you loyal to a structure that costs you your own life force. Now notice the deeper bargain. You may be paying for the family's unconscious guilt. families carry transgenerational material traumas, shames, secrets, ungrieved losses that were never metabolized. In Jungian language, the collective unconscious is not only archetypes, it is also the inherited psychic atmosphere. When a family refuses to face something, it does not disappear. It migrates into symptoms, roles, and repeating dramas. One child often becomes the living solution to a problem no one names. You become the one who doesn't need anything. So no one has to face their inadequacy. You become the one who keeps it together. So no one has to face the chaos. You become the one who forgives. So no one has to face accountability. This produces a strange internal confusion. You feel guilty when you are innocent, and strangely calm when you are mistreated, because the contract trained you to equate guilt with belonging. If you feel guilty, you can fix it. If you can fix it, you have a place. Innocence in a distorted system is destabilizing because it removes your role. If you are truly innocent, then the system must locate responsibility elsewhere. The contract prevents that by making you emotionally responsible even when you are factually not. You may also notice a compulsion to explain your motives, to prove your goodness, to demonstrate that you are not cruel. This compulsion is not simply kindness. It is fear of being cast into the family's shadow role, the selfish one, the ungrateful one, the traitor. Every family has a shadow role, a container for what the group refuses to see in itself. When you individuate even slightly, you threaten the group's self-image, and the group may respond by attempting to push you into that shadow role. Then you over-explain to climb out of it, but the contract ensures you can never climb out through explanation. Because the purpose of the accusation is not understanding, it is control. A second aha sits here if you are honest enough to feel it. You are not arguing for truth. You are arguing for permission to exist as separate, and no argument will ever grant that permission, because permission is not what is missing. What is missing is the family's capacity to tolerate your separateness without collapsing into blame, withdrawal, or attack. The contract disguised that incapacity as your obligation to be endlessly reasonable. When you begin to see this, you may feel a sharp grief, not sentimental grief, but structural grief, because it means there was never a moment where your full self was negotiated. The contract was implicit. You were recruited into emotional labor before you had language. And the painful part is this. You may have internalized the family's voice so deeply that you continue enforcing the contract even when they are not present. You punish yourself for resting. You justify your boundaries to imaginary judges. You anticipate their reactions and preemptively soften your life. The family has become an inner committee. The contract has become self-surveillance. This is why the problem is not solved by distance alone. Distance may reduce immediate pressure, but the inner contract remains until it is named in its mechanisms: projection, role assignment, complex activation, shadow exile, and the payoff structure that keeps you loyal. If you do not see the payoff, you will call the contract toxic and still obey it. Because the psyche obeys what it believes ensures survival, your task is not to become inspiring, it is to become accurate. Accuracy begins by identifying your assigned function. Are you the emotional translator, the scapegoat, the golden child who must never fail, the invisible one who must not take up space, the therapist child who hears confessions and offers absolution, the financial rescuer, the mediator, the one who absorbs rage so others can stay good? Each function has a specific set of reflexes. Each reflex is an unconscious clause in the contract. And then you watch how the family activates your complexes with precision. A simple comment becomes a hook, a sigh becomes a verdict, a delayed reply becomes proof you are cold. These are not random sensitivities. They are trigger points installed by repetition. A complex is an autonomous cluster of emotion and belief. When activated, it hijacks the ego. The contract relies on complex activation. It pulls you out of adult choice and back into child-positioned reaction. You begin defending, soothing, explaining, rescuing before you have even decided whether the situation deserves your energy. The most ruthless part is that you may call these reactions love, but love does not require self-abandonment. Love does not require you to disappear so others can remain comfortable. The contract is not love. It is a survival arrangement with a sentimental label. You do not need closure to see this. You need the willingness to stop confusing familiarity with truth. If your family only recognizes you when you perform a role, then the recognition is for the role, not for you. And if you have built your identity on being recognized for the role, then your ego will panic when the role is threatened. That panic will tempt you back into the old clauses. Justify, explain, soften, fix, return. But something changes once the contract is visible. You can no longer call compulsion a choice. You can no longer call fear kindness. You can no longer call self-erasure maturity. The mechanism has a name now, and that name begins to interrupt the trance. Once the contract is seen, the psyche reacts in a predictable way. It looks for a loophole that allows awareness without consequence. You may think, I see it now, but I can still be reasonable, or I just explain better, with more compassion, or I'll keep my boundaries internally while staying externally agreeable. These are not integrations, they are renegotiations that leave the structure intact. The contract survives by offering you subtler versions of the same role. It does not demand your ignorance, it demands your participation. The reason participation is so compelling is that the contract is anchored in fear that predates conscious memory. It is not the fear of an argument, it is the fear of destabilization, the sense that if you do not perform, something catastrophic will happen, someone will collapse, rage will erupt, love will be withdrawn, the family narrative will fracture. This fear is not imagined. It was learned. At some point, the environment taught you that your adaptation prevented real harm. That lesson fossilized into belief. But here is the next realization that tends to arrive with resistance. Even if your role once prevented harm, it no longer functions as protection. It functions as preservation of dysfunction. What once stabilized a fragile system now freezes it. The family's inability to develop emotional responsibility has been subsidized by your over-functioning. The longer the subsidy continues, the less incentive there is for anyone else to change. This is not cruelty on their part, it is structural dependency. Dependency creates resentment on both sides. You may resent them for needing so much. They may resent you for reminding them unconsciously of their own inadequacy. That resentment is rarely spoken. It is acted out through subtle devaluation, dismissal, or guilt induction. The contract promises belonging, but it delivers a specific kind of loneliness. You are surrounded, but not met. Projection intensifies at this stage because awareness threatens the old balance. When you begin to withdraw your automatic compliance, the family psyche searches for an explanation that preserves its self-image. It rarely finds an accurate one. Instead, it locates a moral flaw in you. You are cold, influenced, arrogant, unstable, selfish, ungrateful, dramatic, or not yourself. These labels are not diagnoses, they are defensive maneuvers. They reframe your differentiation as pathology, so the system does not have to examine itself. Notice how quickly you are tempted to refute these labels. You want to show evidence. You want to clarify intentions. You want to prove continuity. I'm still the same person, but the accusation is not about facts. It is about restoring the old position. If you disprove one charge, another will appear. The contract is not enforced through logic. It is enforced through affect, shame, guilt, fear of abandonment. This is where the shadow becomes active in a new way. Previously, the shadow held your anger, refusal, and self-priority, because expressing them threatened attachment. Now, as you begin to see the contract, those qualities press upward. You may feel irritability without a clear object. You may feel contempt for patterns you once tolerated. You may fantasize about disappearing or severing ties abruptly. These impulses are not wisdom, but they are information. They signal how much psychic energy has been suppressed to keep the contract running. If you moralize these impulses, calling them bad, unloving, or immature, you push them back into the shadow, where they will resurface indirectly as exhaustion, cynicism, or sudden explosions. If you romanticize them, turning anger into identity, you risk swinging from submission to counter-control. Neither resolves the mechanism. The task is recognition without enactment, to see what the shadow contains and why it was banished. The father and mother complexes often reassert themselves here with surprising force. You may notice that asserting yourself feels like disobeying a parent, even if the person in front of you is a sibling, a partner, or a colleague. The inner image of authority or nurturance is activated. You feel small, reckless, or cruel for wanting autonomy. This is not because autonomy is wrong. It is because autonomy was historically punished or linked to loss. In families where the father complex is dominant and unresolved, separation is equated with betrayal. Authority is experienced as fragile. Questioning it feels dangerous. In families where the mother complex is dominant and unresolved, separation is equated with abandonment. Caretaking becomes compulsory. Individuation feels like murder. These are not exaggerations at the level of the unconscious. The child's psyche experiences relational rupture as annihilation. The adult psyche still carries that imprint. This is why the contract is so effective. It recruits your nervous system. Your body reacts before your intellect. A simple boundary can trigger a surge of anxiety that feels disproportional to the situation. You may interpret that anxiety as evidence that you are doing something wrong. In reality, it is evidence that you are doing something unfamiliar. The body is reacting to the loss of a known pattern, not to moral failure. Another mechanism surfaces here. Identity collapse, anxiety. If you have been the one who understands, the one who holds it together, the one who forgives, then removing the role creates a temporary void. You may ask yourself, who am I if I don't do this? The contract did not just organize relationships, it organized your self-concept. Without it, you may feel undefined, selfish, or empty. That emptiness is not pathology, it is the absence of a false structure. However, emptiness is uncomfortable, and the psyche seeks to fill it quickly. This is where people often recreate the same contract elsewhere. In romantic relationships, friendships, workplaces, or spiritual communities. The roles change names, but the structure remains. You become indispensable again. You become the emotional anchor again. You become the one who explains again. The family contract migrates because it was never consciously terminated, it was only relocated. Narcissistic dynamics are particularly effective carriers of this migration. A narcissistic structure again, not necessarily a person with a label, offers you a familiar economy, your attunement for their validation, your labor for their image, your silence for their stability. It feels recognizable. You know how to survive there. The contract whispers, at least you know the rules. At this point, a sobering realization may appear. Your loyalty to the contract is not primarily loyalty to your family. It is loyalty to your adapted identity. You protect the role because without it, you face uncertainty, grief, and the task of building a self that is not immediately useful to others. The contract spared you that work for a long time. It gave you a ready-made purpose. Purpose, even painful purpose, can be addictive. There is also a subtler payoff, moral immunity. As long as you are the one who sacrifices, you do not have to risk being the one who harms. As long as you are the one who understands, you do not have to face your own aggression. As long as you are the one who explains, you do not have to tolerate misunderstanding. These immunities feel virtuous, but they keep parts of you undeveloped. They also keep you from encountering the ordinary friction of adult relationships, where misunderstanding, disappointment, and conflict are not signs of failure but conditions of reality. The collective unconscious reinforces this trap by rewarding self-sacrifice with cultural narratives of virtue. Families often cloak the contract in moral language. Family comes first. Blood is thicker than water. You're so strong. You're the only one who understands. Don't be selfish. These phrases are not neutral. They activate archetypal images of duty, loyalty, and goodness. When archetypes are used defensively, they become tools of control rather than sources of meaning. You may notice that when you speak from your own perspective without translation, the response is not curiosity but accusation. This is diagnostic. It indicates that the system is not interested in your inner reality, it is interested in restoring equilibrium. A system that values relationship over regulation can tolerate difference. A system that values regulation over relationship experiences difference as threat. At this stage, the compulsion to justify often intensifies because the stakes feel higher. You are no longer just managing moods, you are challenging identity structures. The family story about itself may depend on your role. If you step out, someone else may have to confront their own avoidance, dependency, or aggression. That confrontation is often resisted with force. You may be told you are overthinking, being influenced, or creating problems. These statements function to collapse complexity back into simplicity. They imply that the issue is your perception, not the structure. If you accept that framing, the contract resets. If you reject it outright with contempt, you risk becoming reactive. The middle position is less dramatic and more difficult to see the maneuver without needing to defeat it. This is where the idea of responsibility must be clarified. You have been trained to take responsibility for outcomes that are not yours. True responsibility is limited to what you control, your actions, your boundaries, your participation. You are not responsible for another adult's emotional regulation, self-esteem, or interpretation. The contract blurred this boundary deliberately. It taught you that responsibility equals responsiveness. That equation must be dismantled. Dismantling does not require confrontation. It requires withdrawal of automatic compliance. It requires tolerating the discomfort of not fixing what is not yours. It requires enduring misinterpretation without rushing to correct it. These are not techniques. They are consequences of a changed internal position. If you still feel compelled to announce your boundaries with elaborate explanations, the contract is still active. Silence, brevity, and consistency reveal more than declarations. As you practice this, you may experience a new kind of grief, the realization that the family may never meet you as you are, not because you failed to explain, but because meeting you would require them to relinquish the benefits of the old arrangement. This grief is not self-pity. It is mourning the loss of an imagined future, where recognition arrives if you just endure a little longer. The psyche often resists this grief by turning it into anger or superiority. Both are defenses. Anger externalizes pain, superiority numbs it. Neither allows you to see clearly. Clear seeing acknowledges limitation without collapse. It accepts that some relationships are structured around roles rather than mutuality, and that no amount of insight will convert a structure that is invested in not changing. What emerges in place of the contract is not immediately freedom. It is ambiguity. You may feel less entangled, but also less anchored. This is not regression. It is the interim state between adaptation and individuation. Individuation, in Jungian terms, is not self-expression without regard for others. It is the alignment of inner and outer life such that roles no longer substitute for identity. That alignment cannot be rushed, and it cannot be performed for approval. If you are honest, you may notice a temptation to seek validation for your clarity, to tell your story, to be affirmed as right. This is understandable. But if validation becomes necessary, the contract has simply changed audiences. Clarity does not need witnesses to be real. It needs consistency. The family contract loses power not when it is exposed dramatically, but when it is no longer obeyed reflexively. Each time you notice the impulse to explain and choose not to, something shifts. Each time you allow someone else to feel their disappointment without rescuing them, something shifts. Each time you refuse to accept projected guilt, something shifts. These shifts are quiet. They do not produce applause. They produce space, and in that space, a different question begins to form. Not how do I make this work, but what is actually mine? This question is dangerous to the old structure because it relocates authority. It does not ask permission. It does not accuse. It simply reclaims jurisdiction. At this point, there is no inspiring conclusion to offer. The contract does not dissolve in a moment. It weakens through repeated non-compliance. Seeing it does not make you immune to it. It makes you responsible for noticing when you are about to sign again. As the contract weakens through non-compliance, another layer becomes visible, one that is often more disturbing than the original bargain. You begin to see how much of your inner life has been organized around anticipation. Not action, not choice, but anticipation. You anticipate reactions before they occur. You anticipate disappointment before you speak. You anticipate accusation before you move. This anticipatory posture is not anxiety in the abstract. It is a learned vigilance born from living inside other people's thresholds. The family contract trained you to scan constantly for shifts in mood, tone, silence, posture. You learned to read microsignals because missing them had consequences. Over time, this hyper-attunement masqueraded as empathy, but empathy, in its psychological sense, is the capacity to resonate while remaining separate, What you developed was closer to preemptive compliance. You feel others before you feel yourself. You adjust before you decide. You soften before you assert. The contract does not merely govern behavior, it colonizes attention. This colonization produces a specific distortion of self-trust. You may trust your intelligence, your insight, your perception of others, but you do not trust your own right to act on what you see. You pause, re-evaluate, contextualize, and soften conclusions that are already accurate. This is not humility, it is the residue of a system that punished certainty when certainty threatened equilibrium. Here, a deeper realization often arrives. You were not trained to be wrong, you were trained to doubt yourself. The contract did not require you to abandon perception. It required you to suspend it, to keep it provisional, to keep it negotiable. This is why clarity feels dangerous. Clarity ends negotiation. It collapses the space in which the contract operates. When clarity emerges, projection intensifies again, but reminds you of something crucial. Projection is not random. It targets your strength. If you are accused of being cold, it is because you are becoming less manipulable. If you are accused of being selfish, it is because you are no longer overgiving. If you are accused of being distant, it is because your emotional availability is no longer automatic. The accusation reveals what is being lost. This is the point where many people misinterpret what is happening. They think they are being punished for becoming cruel. In fact, they are being punished for becoming opaque. Systems built on emotional extraction require transparency. They require access. They require you to explain yourself so your motives can be evaluated, corrected, or neutralized. When you stop explaining, you interrupt the extraction process. That interruption is experienced as threat. The shadow now shifts position. Previously, it held aggression and refusal. Now it may begin to hold vulnerability. You may notice that you feel strangely exposed when you do not perform without the role. There is no script. Without the script, you cannot predict how you will be received. This exposure is not weakness. It is the absence of armor. The contract provided armor by telling you exactly who to be. Without it, you must tolerate uncertainty. This is where identity formed through adaptation reveals its limit. Adaptation produces functionality, not solidity. It creates a self that works, not a self that rests. When the adaptive identity loosens, you may feel for the first time how tired you are, not from effort, but from vigilance. A life organized around preventing rupture is exhausting. The body carries this exhaustion, even when the mind calls it normal. The family may respond to your withdrawal with narratives of concern. We are worried about you. You seem different. This isn't like you. These statements appear caring, but they often conceal a demand for restoration. They frame your differentiation as decline. If you accept the frame, you will try to reassure them by returning to form. If you reject it with hostility, you reinforce their belief that you have changed for the worse. Neither response alters the structure. only consistency does. Consistency is not rigidity. It is a repeated alignment between inner decision and outer action. It is saying less and meaning it. It is tolerating the discomfort of not correcting false interpretations. It is allowing silence to do what explanation once did. Silence, here, is not punishment. It is absence of labor. This absence reveals another uncomfortable truth. Much of what you believed was mutuality was actually dependence on your participation. When you stop participating, some relationships thin out. This thinning can feel like loss, but it is more accurate to call it exposure. The relationship is revealed in its actual form, not its imagined one. At this stage, guilt often mutates. It becomes less acute but more diffuse. You may feel guilty not for what you did, but for what you are no longer doing. This guilt is abstract because the offense is undefined. You are not breaking a rule, you are exiting a pattern. The psyche does not like pattern loss. It interprets it as danger. The contract exploited that preference. Now you must endure its absence. Here the collective unconscious contributes another pressure, the archetype of the good child. This archetype is powerful because it promises harmony through obedience. It equates goodness with compliance. Families unconsciously invoke it when they sense loss of control. You may be reminded of how you used to be, as if maturity were regression and regression were virtue. This is not nostalgia, it is archetypal enforcement. If you are not careful, you may begin to perform a subtler version of the role, appearing autonomous while remaining emotionally available for regulation. This is partial compliance. It reduces overt conflict but preserves the core dynamic. The test is simple but difficult. When someone is distressed, do you feel an immediate obligation to fix it? If yes, the contract still has leverage. Responsibility must be redefined again here. Responsibility is not responsiveness. Responsibility is accountability for your own actions and their foreseeable consequences, not for the emotional states of others. The contract conflated these to keep you engaged. Untangling them feels cold at first, because warmth was previously used as currency. This coldness is often misnamed. Others may call it detachment or indifference. In reality, it is boundary clarity. You are no longer entering emotional transactions without consent. That consent was never asked for before. It was assumed. Now the assumption is gone. You may notice an increase in internal dialogue aimed at justifying yourself to an imagined audience. This is the internalized family speaking. It has not yet learned that explanation is no longer required. Each time you notice this dialogue and do not obey it, you weaken the internal contract. The external contract cannot survive without the internal one. As this internal shift consolidates, you may feel a strange loneliness even when alone. This loneliness is not absence of people, it is absence of role. You are not yet accustomed to existing without being needed. The psyche interprets this as emptiness, but emptiness in this context is unoccupied space. It is the first time your inner life is not rented out. There is a temptation here to fill the space quickly with productivity, new relationships, or ideological certainty. Filling the space recreates structure without examination. Letting the space remain unsettled allows something else to emerge. Preference. Preference is different from obligation. Preference says, I choose this, not this is required. With preference has no place in the contract. The contract does not care what you prefer. It cares what you provide. When preference begins to guide action, the old system loses coherence. You may find yourself declining invitations without explanation, disengaging from conversations that spiral into blame, or allowing misunderstandings to stand. These acts are not dramatic, they are simply no longer responsive to coercion. The family may escalate at this point. Escalation is not proof you are wrong. It is proof that the previous level of control no longer works. Escalation can take many forms: intensified guilt, sudden affection, moral appeals, or crises that demand your return. Not every crisis is manipulative, but the contract trained you to respond to urgency without assessment. Assessment is now necessary. Assessment asks, is this truly mine to handle? Did I create this situation? Am I the only possible support? What happens if I do nothing? These questions were previously forbidden. Now they are unavoidable. The answers may be uncomfortable because they reveal how often your intervention was optional, not essential. Here another realization may land with force. Your withdrawal does not destroy the family. It exposes its limits. Those limits were always there. You were covering them. The fear that everything would collapse without you was partly a projection of your own childhood experience, not an accurate forecast of the present. This does not mean there will be no consequences. There are always consequences when patterns change. Some relationships will deteriorate. Some people will never adjust. Some will redefine you permanently as the problem. This is not injustice, it is differentiation. Differentiation requires the capacity to be misjudged without collapse. At this point, there is no clean resolution. The contract does not end with an announcement. It fades as your reflexes change. It fades as you stop explaining. It fades as you stop volunteering emotional labor. It fades as you allow others to carry what is theirs. What remains is not certainty or peace. It is accuracy. You see what was exchanged, why it was exchanged, and what it cost. You see how loyalty was purchased, how guilt was installed, how identity was shaped by necessity rather than choice. And once this is seen, you cannot unknow it. Even if you comply again, you will feel the mechanism. Even if you return temporarily, you will recognize the price. The contract loses its invisibility. That is not freedom, it is awareness. What remains to be faced now is the most resistant layer of the contract, the internal authority that continues to enforce it even in the absence of pressure. By this stage, the family no longer needs to demand. The demand has been internalized. You monitor yourself, you correct yourself, you preemptively restrain impulses that might disturb the imagined equilibrium. The system has moved inside. This is why distance alone never resolved it. You can live far away, speak rarely, and still feel compelled to justify your decisions to people who are not present. You can imagine conversations that never happen and rehearse explanations that will never be requested. This is not rumination. It is obedience to an internalized tribunal whose rules were written before you had consent. This tribunal is built from introjected figures, internal representations of parental authority, familial judgment, and collective expectation. It does not ask whether something is true. It asks whether something is acceptable. It does not ask whether something is necessary. It asks whether something is destabilizing. The contract survives as long as this inner authority remains unquestioned. Here is the realization that often arrives with quiet severity. The family contract did not merely cost you energy, it displaced your center of authority. Decisions about your life were filtered through an internalized we rather than an embodied I. Even when you believed you were choosing freely, you were often choosing what minimized disruption, not what reflected alignment. This displacement explains a specific kind of confusion that may have followed you for years. You may have been competent, insightful, and capable, yet strangely unsure about what you actually want. Desire felt vague. Preference felt negotiable. Conviction felt dangerous. This was not indecision. It was the absence of practice in self-reference. The contract trained you to reference the system, not yourself. Once this is seen, another defense often emerges. The wish to replace the old authority with a new one, an ideology, a psychological framework, a moral position that promises certainty. This is understandable. Authority vacuums are uncomfortable. But replacing one borrowed authority with another does not restore agency. It only relocates it. Agency begins with tolerating the anxiety of making decisions without external validation. That anxiety is not evidence of error. It is evidence of development. A psyche that has always oriented around others experiences self-orientation as risk. The nervous system reacts accordingly. The task is not to eliminate this reaction, but to recognize it as transitional. At this point, guilt often attempts one final maneuver. It becomes existential. You may feel guilty not because you harmed someone, but because you no longer feel compelled to save them. This guilt has no object, because its function is not moral correction. Its function is reattachment. If you feel guilty, you are still oriented toward the system. If you feel responsible, you are still available. Here, the distinction between compassion and responsibility must be held precisely. Compassion allows you to see suffering without absorbing it. Responsibility absorbs suffering and treats it as duty. The contract blurred these deliberately. You were taught that to care meant to carry. That equation must be dissolved, or guilt will continue to masquerade as virtue. Another mechanism becomes visible now. The family's reliance on your predictability. Predictability is often mistaken for trustworthiness. In reality, predictability is control. When others know exactly how you will respond, they can structure themselves around your response without self-examination. Your unpredictability, your refusal to perform on cue, forces them into contact with themselves. That contact is uncomfortable. The contract existed to prevent it. You may notice that when you stop being predictable, others become anxious, critical, or suddenly attentive. None of these responses are evidence of your importance or your cruelty. They are evidence of recalibration. The system is testing whether the old rules still apply. If you resume the role, even briefly, the system will stabilize immediately. That stabilization can feel like relief, but it is relief purchased by regression. Each time you return, the contract tightens. Each time you resist, it loosens incrementally. There is no dramatic breaking point. There is only repetition. By now, another truth may be unavoidable. You were never actually protecting the family from collapse. You were protecting it from change. Collapse and change feel similar to systems that depend on stasis. The family's survival narrative may have framed adaptation as sacrifice and differentiation as threat. That narrative kept everyone in place. This does not mean the family is consciously manipulative. Most contracts are unconscious. They are inherited patterns playing themselves out through people who believe they are acting freely. Blame adds nothing here. Clarity does. Clarity reveals that your suffering was functional. It served a purpose. That purpose was not your growth. It was the maintenance of equilibrium. Once you see this, suffering loses its moral glow. It becomes data. With this clarity comes a more sobering task. Deciding what kind of relationships you are willing to participate in now. Not repairing old ones, not educating others, but choosing the terms under which you engage, terms that do not require you to disappear, terms that do not require constant explanation, terms that allow misunderstanding without punishment. You may find that some relationships cannot exist under these terms. This is not a tragedy. It is an exposure. The relationship depended on a contract you are no longer willing to sign. There is no ceremony for this refusal. It is enacted through behavior, not announcement. Internally, the contract may still attempt to reassert itself during moments of stress. Fatigue lowers resistance. Nostalgia softens memory. Crisis tempts return. When this happens, the task is not self-criticism, it is recognition. You see the impulse, you know where it comes from, you know what it costs. At this stage, the most difficult discipline is restraint, not restraint from anger or speech, but restraint from self-erasure. You resist the impulse to clarify your existence. You resist the impulse to be understood at any cost. You resist the impulse to trade your inner alignment for external calm. What replaces the contract is not a new identity, but a different orientation. You reference yourself first, not aggressively, not defensively, simply factually. You ask what you can do, not what you should absorb. You act from choice, not reflex. This orientation will feel bare at first. It lacks the familiar density of obligation. There is no guarantee that this will make you liked, admired, or included. Those were benefits of compliance. What it offers instead is coherence. Your actions align with your perceptions. Your words align with your limits. Your silence aligns with your refusal to perform. And there is one final clarity that does not arrive as insight, but as consequence. Once you stop living inside the contract, you see it everywhere, in other families, in workplaces, in relationships built on emotional extraction. You recognize the signs quickly. The pressure to explain, the demand to be reasonable in the face of distortion, the confusion between care and compliance. This recognition does not obligate you to intervene. It simply prevents you from mistaking these dynamics for intimacy. You no longer call familiarity truth. You no longer call endurance love. Nothing about this process is triumphant. There is no final resolution. There is only a narrowing gap between what you see and what you do. The contract loses its power not because it is defeated, but because it is no longer invisible. And once it is visible, every time you are asked explicitly or implicitly to sign it again, you will know exactly what is being requested, exactly what it costs, and exactly why you hesitate.